Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Whispers in the Night. Daniel had always been an observant boy. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he paid attention to the little things. The creak of the stairs, the faint whistle of the wind sneaking through old window panes, the way shadows shifted as the streetlights flickered outside. But nothing in his 14 years of life had prepared him for what he would come to face one summer when his seemingly ordinary world tilted into the uncanny. The first strange incident happened late on a humid Thursday night. Daniel lay sprawled on his bed, one leg hanging off the side as the soft hum of his television filled the room. His father worked late shifts at the factory, leaving him and his older brother, Ethan, alone in the house most evenings. Ethan, however, preferred the basement, where he spent hours gaming, headphones clamped tightly over his ears. That night was no different, and Daniel relished the solitude upstairs. At precisely 11:34 p.m., the TV blinked off without warning. Daniel frowned, glancing at the remote lying untouched beside him. Before he could reach for it, the screen flickered back to life. Static filled the room for a brief moment before the show he had been watching resumed. "Cheap wiring," he muttered under his breath, chalking it up to the quirks of their old house. He turned the volume down and closed his eyes, hoping to drift off to sleep. Just as the comforting pull of slumber began to claim him, the TV shut off again. This time it didn't come back on. Daniel sat up, irritation bubbling to the surface. He pressed the power button on the remote repeatedly, but nothing happened. He gave the TV a hard glare before finally muttering, "Stupid thing," and unplugging it altogether. As he climbed back under his blanket, his thoughts drifted to the upcoming weekend. He had plans to meet up with his friend Caleb to shoot hoops at the park, a much-needed break from the monotony of summer break. The rhythmic chirping of crickets outside began to lull him to sleep. That's when he heard it. A faint rustling sound, like fingers brushing against paper. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the noise. It seemed to come from above him, from the ceiling. The house occasionally groaned under its own weight, but this was different. It was deliberate, methodical, and far too close for comfort. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon in the attic or the wind playing tricks. Forcing himself to ignore the unease prickling at the back of his neck, he pulled the blanket over his head and willed himself to sleep. The following morning, Daniel woke to an unsettling sight. As the first rays of sunlight crept into his room, something on the ceiling caught his eye. Handprints, dozens of them, smudged across the edge where the wall met the ceiling. They were faint but unmistakable, their outlines streaked with what looked like grime or mud. He blinked several times, hoping his groggy vision was playing tricks on him, but the prints didn't disappear. Swallowing hard, Daniel climbed onto his desk chair to get a closer look. The prints were uneven, some smaller than others, and all seemed to be clawing at the edges as if trying to escape. He hesitated before running a finger across one. The residue felt damp, sticky, and left a dark smear on his skin. "Gross," he muttered, wiping his hand on his pajama pants. Ethan was already in the kitchen when Daniel finally made his way downstairs. He found his brother munching on a bowl of cereal, completely engrossed in his phone. "Hey, did you go into my room last night?" Daniel asked, leaning against the doorway. Ethan didn't look up. "Why would I go into your room? Your TV sucks." "I'm serious," Daniel pressed. "There are marks on my ceiling. Probably mold," Ethan replied with a shrug. "This house is old as hell." Daniel didn't push further. He knew better than to expect concern from his older brother, who rarely took anything seriously. Still, the thought lingered in his mind as he went about his day. By the time night fell, Daniel had managed to convince himself that the handprints were just dirt, maybe from a leak in the attic. He didn't even bother mentioning it to his dad, who had enough on his plate already. But as the hours crept toward midnight, a new unease settled over him. The room felt different, heavier, as if the air itself were watching him. He dismissed the irrational thought and focused on the movie playing on his laptop. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. His head snapped toward the window, but nothing was there. The curtains swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Then it happened again, a flicker of motion, this time near his closet. Daniel's heart began to pound as he stared into the darkness, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light. He tightened his grip on his blanket, the fabric suddenly feeling like a flimsy shield against whatever was out there. "Get a grip," he whispered to himself, but the shadows persisted. They darted across the room, their movements erratic and fast, disappearing before he could fully register them. The final straw came when one shadow lingered, hunched and unnaturally still, just a few feet away from his bed. Daniel's breath hitched, and for a moment, he felt paralyzed, unable to look away. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow melted into the wall. The days that followed were uneventful, though Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He started sleeping with a nightlight, something he hadn't done since he was a child. It helped, but only slightly. One evening, as he sat on his bed flipping through an old comic book, the TV flickered on by itself. He froze, staring at the glowing screen. Static crackled for several seconds before the screen went black again. Daniel reached for the remote, but before he could press any buttons, a voice cut through the silence. "How are you today?" The words were slow, raspy, and distinctly inhuman. Daniel's blood turned cold as he stared at the dark screen. The voice had sounded as though it were right next to him, close enough to feel its breath. He bolted, grabbing his backpack and shoving random items into it. His hands shook as he fumbled with the doorknob, adrenaline coursing through his veins. By the time he reached the stairs, he was nearly in tears. Daniel's father, Greg, arrived home later that evening to find his son and older brother Ethan seated at the kitchen table. Ethan wore his usual look of indifference, but Daniel's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the staircase every few seconds. "What's going on?" Greg asked, setting his lunchbox on the counter. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had raised two sons alone after their mother's death. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding crazy. Ethan took a swig of soda and said, "Danny's scared of his own shadow. Literally." "I'm not making it up," Daniel snapped, his voice shaking slightly. He turned to his father. "Dad, something's wrong with my room. The TV keeps acting weird, there are noises in the walls, and I heard a voice." Greg raised an eyebrow. "A voice?" Daniel nodded. It said, "How are you today?" It wasn't the TV, it was in the room with me. Greg leaned against the counter, studying his son. "Are you sure you're not just tired or stressed? You've been staying up late a lot recently." "I'm not imagining it," Daniel insisted, his voice rising. "There were handprints on the ceiling a few days ago, dirty ones. And now, this." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Probably just raccoons or something in the attic. You're freaking out over nothing." But Greg didn't dismiss it as quickly. He had seen the look in Daniel's eyes before. Once, years ago, when the boy had fallen into the lake during a camping trip and thought he was going to drown. It was the look of genuine fear. "All right," Greg said finally. "I'll take a look." Greg started with the attic. It was a cramped, dusty space filled with boxes of old clothes and Christmas decorations. Armed with a flashlight, he climbed the rickety pull-down ladder and began inspecting every corner. The air was stifling, and the beam of light revealed a maze of cobwebs and insulation. He found no signs of animals, no droppings, no nests, nothing to suggest that raccoons or mice had been causing the noises Daniel had described. The handprints, however, were harder to explain. When Greg inspected Daniel's room, he saw faint smudges along the edge of the ceiling. They were faint but unmistakably human. "You sure you didn't try to climb up there yourself?" Greg asked. Daniel shook his head vehemently. "How would I even get up there?" Greg didn't have an answer. He rubbed the back of his neck, unease settling in. After cleaning the marks with a damp cloth, he checked the walls and floorboards for anything unusual. Everything seemed normal, until he tapped the section of wall near the head of Daniel's bed. It sounded hollow. "What's behind this wall?" Greg muttered to himself. The house was old, and he'd always suspected there were unused spaces within its structure. Still, he hadn't thought much of it until now. "Dad!" Daniel's voice wavered. "What is it?" Greg forced a smile. "Probably just an empty crawl space. I'll take a closer look tomorrow." But as he left the room that night, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next few nights passed without incident, and Daniel began to relax, thinking perhaps his father's cleaning efforts had somehow resolved the issue. But then, on a quiet Friday evening, the tapping returned. It started faintly, just a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the wall behind his bed. At first, Daniel thought it might be the pipes or the house settling, as his dad had suggested. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, and began to move. Top, top, top. The noise traveled along the wall, pausing occasionally before resuming. Daniel sat frozen, his heart pounding. When the tapping reached the corner of the room, it stopped abruptly. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like fingernails dragging across wood. Daniel grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the walls. Nothing was there, but the sound persisted, growing louder until it was almost unbearable. "Dad!" Daniel screamed, bolting from the room. Greg was already halfway up the stairs, a baseball bat in hand. "What happened?" "It's back," Daniel gasped, clutching his chest. "The noise! It's louder now." Greg marched into the room, his expression grim. The tapping had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He checked every corner, every inch of the wall, but found nothing. "Go downstairs," he told Daniel. "I'll handle this." The next morning, Greg borrowed a stud finder and a crowbar from a neighbor. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, he began carefully prying away the drywall in Daniel's room. The process was slow and messy, but eventually, he uncovered a small, hidden space between the walls. It was a narrow cavity, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. The flashlight revealed old wood beams and a few scraps of newspaper yellowed with age. But then Greg noticed something that made his stomach drop. Scratches. Deep, erratic scratches marred the wooden beams, as though someone or something had clawed at them in desperation. He also found what looked like fragments of fabric, worn and dirty, snagged on the wood. "What the hell?" Greg muttered under his breath. When he emerged from the room, Daniel and Ethan were waiting anxiously in the hallway. "Well?" Ethan asked. Greg hesitated. "It's strange. There's a small space back there, but nothing alive. Just some old stuff. I'll patch it up later." Daniel frowned. "But what about the noises? The tapping?" Greg didn't have an answer. Instead, he changed the subject. "Why don't we all get out of the house for a bit? Go see a movie or something?" Over the next few days, Greg spent hours researching the history of the house. He discovered that it had been built in the 1940s by a man named Arthur Grayson, who had lived there with his wife and 2 children. According to old records, the family had vanished without a trace in the 1950s, leaving the house abandoned for several years before it was sold to new owners. Greg also found a disturbing article from the local newspaper archives. It detailed the discovery of a child's shoe buried in the backyard of the house, along with small bones that authorities believed belonged to a cat or dog. No further investigation had been conducted. Greg's unease grew with each piece of information. He didn't share his findings with Daniel or Ethan, not wanting to scare them further. But he began to wonder if the strange occurrences were tied to the house's dark past. One evening, while Greg was at work and Ethan was out with friends, Daniel found himself alone in the house. He tried to distract himself with a video game, but the oppressive silence was unnerving. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he climbed into bed, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder than ever, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. Daniel's breath hitched as he strained to make out the words. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost childlike, and sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed his phone and called his dad. But the call went straight to voicemail. Desperate, he texted Ethan, who replied with a dismissive, "Stop being a baby." Daniel curled up under his blanket, trying to block out the noise. But the tapping grew more frantic, the whispers more urgent. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He bolted from the room and spent the rest of the night on the couch, the lights on and a baseball bat by his side. The weeks following the discovery of the hidden space behind Daniel's bedroom wall were filled with an unsettling quietness. Greg had thought he resolved the mystery. At least, that was what he told himself as he patched the wall and tried to convince Daniel that everything was fine. But deep down, Greg knew the truth. Something was wrong with the house. That night, as Greg sat in the living room, the hairs on the back of his neck began to rise. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house felt colder, emptier, and more oppressive with each passing day. Daniel, on the other hand, had begun to withdraw further. He spent more time in his room, his eyes distant, his demeanor strangely quiet. It was as though the boy was no longer fully present. He would jump at the slightest sound, his gaze lingering on the walls for far too long. And there was that same look in his eyes, the look that Greg had seen when Daniel had almost drowned all those years ago. "Everything okay, Danny?" Greg asked, trying to engage his son as they ate dinner together one evening. Daniel looked up, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly as he pushed his food around on his plate. "I don't know, Dad. I don't feel right. The house, it's like it's alive or something. The walls, I swear they move." Greg had heard it all before. But this time, there was something different in Daniel's voice. A tremor. A genuine fear that was hard to ignore. "I'll take care of it," Greg said, his tone firm. "We'll figure this out. Okay? Just stay calm." But Daniel wasn't calm. He had been hearing things again. At night, the tapping, the scratching, the whispers. They were becoming louder, more frequent. It was as though the house was reaching out to him, calling to him in a language only he could understand. That evening, after Greg had gone to bed, the house settled into an eerie silence. But at around 2 a.m., the quiet was broken by the sound of tapping. At first, it was distant, as though coming from the farthest corner of the house. But as it grew louder, it seemed to move closer, methodically, deliberately. Daniel sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The tapping continued, a rhythmic beat that echoed through the walls. He could feel it in his bones, like a drumbeat signaling something terrible was about to happen. "Not again," he whispered to himself. He grabbed his phone and called Greg, but the phone rang endlessly. Panic set in. The sound of tapping had now turned into scratching, dragging across the walls, like something trying to break free. And then, the voice came again. "How are you today?" It was the same voice he had heard weeks before. Low, raspy, like an old woman's whisper. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The voice was closer this time, much closer. "Get out of there, Daniel," he told himself, though his legs felt paralyzed. He wanted to run, but fear held him in place, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence enveloped the room once more, heavy and suffocating. By morning, Daniel was barely able to function. His eyes were bloodshot, his mind racing. The voice had come back. It was no longer a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was getting worse. When Greg arrived home from work, he found Daniel sitting in the living room, clutching the baseball bat he'd kept by his side for days. "Dad, it's not just noises anymore," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I saw it." Greg stopped in his tracks. "What do you mean you saw it?" "I saw her," Daniel whispered. "In the hallway. She was standing there, staring at me." Greg's stomach twisted. He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny the fear in his son's eyes. Something was happening, something beyond his understanding. Together, they went upstairs to Daniel's room. The air felt thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As they entered the room, a cold gust of wind swept through the space, despite the windows being shut. Greg began to investigate the wall again, tapping gently to see if the hollow sound was still there. It was. The tapping was louder now, like a constant, rhythmic beat. "Dad, you have to listen," Daniel pleaded, his voice trembling. "There's something in the wall. I know it. I can feel it." Greg felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure if he believed in ghosts or spirits, but he couldn't ignore the palpable sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. "We're going to get to the bottom of this, Danny," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I promise." But when Greg reached for the crowbar again, something stopped him. A sound from outside the room. A thud. Then another. And then the unmistakable sound of scratching. It was coming from the attic. Greg and Daniel exchanged a look. The scratching had never come from the attic before. The house felt alive again, pulsing with a malevolent energy that sent shivers down their spines. Greg wasted no time. He grabbed the flashlight and motioned for Daniel to stay close behind him as they ascended into the attic. The air grew colder with every step, and the beam of the flashlight flickered, as if fighting to stay alive. When they reached the attic, the scratching grew louder. But this time it wasn't random. It was methodical, deliberate. As Greg shone the light around, he noticed something strange. The walls in the attic were covered in marks. Deep, jagged scratches that looked almost human. They weren't old either. They were fresh. And in the center of the attic, lying amid the dust, was an old wooden chest. It was covered in dirt and cobwebs, but it was the source of the scratching. Greg could feel his pulse quicken. He approached the chest cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Danny," he whispered, "stay back." But Daniel, his curiosity overcoming his fear, stepped forward. Greg grabbed his arm. "We don't know what's in there." Ignoring his father's warning, Daniel opened the chest. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The chest was filled with old, tattered clothes and faded photographs. But at the very bottom, covered in dust, was a bundle wrapped in cloth. When Greg pulled it out, his hands trembling, he uncovered a small, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, handwritten. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "They're coming for you. They won't stop. Not until it's done." The air in the attic grew thick with tension as Daniel read aloud. Greg's eyes widened. This wasn't just some relic from the past. It was a message, a warning. And then, as if on cue, the whispering began again. It wasn't from the walls. It wasn't from the attic. It was coming from inside the chest itself. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice Daniel had heard all those nights ago, the old woman's voice. The realization hit them like a freight train. The house wasn't haunted by the past. The house was the past. A twisted, cyclical nightmare that had never ended. They never stayed in that house again. Daniel and Greg moved out, seeking refuge elsewhere. But the whispers followed them, haunting their every step. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Daniel would wake up, drenched in sweat, hearing that same voice calling to him, "How are you today?" But when he turned to look, the room was empty, the walls silent. The house on the hill, with its secrets and its scars, was left behind. But the echoes, they lingered.